Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and I am also a long-time beta tester and advisor to many developers throughout the flight sim community. In today's video let's talk about what the community can expect in terms of average development times for airliner add-ons. Now, in this video we are going to use the Flight Sim Studios Embraer as an example of an early access aircraft and how quick or not development goes, but it really only serves as an example because the contents of this video is going to be influenced likewise by many years of experience of myself with testing, for example, on the Aerosoft Airbus series, on the PMDG 737 and 777 and 747 and DC-6 and also others. Now let's go ahead and start with a little bit of basics here. Why did I choose the Flight Sim Studios Embraer then? Well, simply for the fact that it is the very first add-on that got released at such an incredibly early state that it was barely unusable for the Flight Sim community to see, and that means that this is a case where everybody in the community could get a very good insight into the continuous development of aircraft. Now, if we are going back to my very early videos on the Embraer, and I don't mean those pre-release, but actually the post-release live stream with Ethai, the actual Embraer captain with whom we did the first check flight and examining the first system statuses, you will remember that the autopilot was not even capable of doing basic things like maintaining an altitude or flying a vertical speed and stuff like that. And basically the systems were non-existent as well, with the FMS only being a small mashup of some default functions. Now, we have seen a little bit of improvement in quite a couple of areas, such as, for example, the autoflight system now being able to master the default selected modes and the FMS being expanded with a little bit of functionality, an EFB was added to the airplane and so on. And that was basically 1 year of development time. So, as you can see, they did show a couple of work in progress things for what's going on with the custom LNAV and VNAV that they're working on in their forums, but we are yet to see any of that in the actual airplane. Now, that leads us basically to development time of a flight management system. It is not the first time that we are waiting for a custom flight management system to be implemented in the MSFS world. Just to give you another example, we might talk about the C-160 Transall from Azzurpoli, which was also released without any custom or without any FMS, to be honest. And that one has gotten its basic FMS after like a couple months, maybe 3 to 4 months of development time. Now, that Azzurpoli FMS, however, had one very big advantage. The real-world FMS of the C-160 Transall was a very simplified tool compared to the FMS in an Embraer, which is a fully fledged FMS having all the lovely features that you are used to from your Airbus and from your favorite Boeing FMS. So, as you can see, Azzurpoli only had a comparably easy job to do, and in that took them several months to just complete some basic LNAV there, with quite a bit of fixing required after the release. Now, one of my favorite developers, whom I'm not going to name by name over here because it's kinda insider information, but anyway, always told me that in order to create a good FMS from scratch, you need approximately 2 years of development time only to create the basic FMS and get a releasable version. And once that is released, you will need at least another year, so we're talking 3 years in total now, in order to do the major bug fixing required and only have small things that you can patch afterwards. So we are looking at approximately 3 years to actually develop a fully custom FMS. Now, I'm very much looking forward to what developers like Flight Sim Studios are eventually going to develop in terms of an Embraer FMS. But just to give you a little bit of an insight, I do have a plan for an upcoming video featuring an FMS trainer that is also used during airline type ratings. that is going to give us a little bit of an insight into how the Embraer FMS actually looks like. If that's a video that you're interested in, then do let me know in the comments below so that I can accelerate it a little bit, in case there is sufficient interest from the community. Now, going back to early access aircraft, we have seen a huge increase in the amount of early access with Microsoft Flight Simulator. Previously, in the P3D or FSX days, early access was something that we only very rarely saw, because developers generally prefer to bring their aircraft to states where you had basic capabilities available, like FMS navigation, even though obviously some were better and some were worse. But the overall point here being that with Microsoft Flight Simulator, we did get a lot more early access, and the quality of that early access has declined with the time as well. While initially we had aircraft like the PMDG 737 that was technically speaking in early access, and seeing that they back in the day coupled it to the pricing of the airplane, which would increase when it's out of early access, I believe we still need to say that this still is in early access. But obviously speaking, the Phoenix, technically speaking, is as well, because it's still not feature complete at this point. So those are examples of the good early access. And then we have airplanes like the Flight Sim Studios Embraer, which was definitely brought to the market much too early. But then we also have other early access examples, such as the TFDI MD-11, which at this point had several pre-sales, and the collector's edition, which is nothing else than an early access, has been released to its 1000 owners. Still is very early access though, seeing that we don't even have things like the sounds, the autopilot isn't working properly yet, even though they're working on it at the time of the recording of this video. But the flight model also still is a placeholder flight model, and things like that. So, coming back to the primary point of this video, what can we expect in terms of development times, and what would be, in my personal opinion, best practice for Flight Sim customers when an early access is released? Well, first of all, let's tidy up with one basic argument. No, don't just buy it in order to support the developers. I would have concurred with that argument like in 2020 when the simulator was first released, but there have been so many examples of developers just not keeping up with their promises, over-promising and under-delivering, that I kinda would refrain from that argument nowadays. However, when an early access airplane is released, my personal recommendation is there will always be YouTubers, and I'm not just talking about myself to generate clicks here, but go to the other guys and check out their early access videos as well. And first thing to do, go ahead, have a look at how the third parties, and I mean those that are not being hired by the developer in order to showcase the product, but those which actually showcase the product after having bought it themselves, or at least only receiving a free copy just after the release, so that you get somewhat of a more neutral opinion on the airplane and that you can see it in action for yourself. And when you see what the airplane is about, that is the point in time to ask yourself, okay, so at what point do I actually want to buy myself that airplane, if I do at all, and how long is it probably gonna take to get there? Now, this again is a point where the Flight Sim Studios Embraers come in as a very good example. When they were first released, they were in a rather poor shape. By now, I would say if those were to be released right now, I would actually call them a fine early access product, because they do have quite a bit of features. You can fly them from A to B, even though there's many things still missing, but by now things are sort of ironed out to a point where I would say that, yeah, you can't really use them on VATSIM yet because of some of the restrictions you have with arrivals and stuff like that, and due to the lack of VNAV, but you're slowly getting there to a point where you can say like, okay, I do believe it is reasonable to expect in a matter of the next couple of months, like maybe 3 or 4 months or so, the airplane should be in a shape where you could actually fly it online and where you could do basic A to B flying with it. Saying basic A to B flying, I am of course still referring to flying a standard flight from A to B, approaching using an ILS, and having the autopilot guide you mostly along the way, with probably a couple of bugs encountered. But in my opinion, that is like the state at which an airplane should be when it's released for early access. Now, to be entirely clear over here, the TFDI MD-11 is much closer to that than the Embraer is at the moment. Then we also have the Transal being let's call it much appreciated early access release, which is also at a good point over there. So at this point, seeing the amount of progress we had with the Embraers over 1 year, you can kind of make yourself an idea of the amount of features developers are able to add to the product. Now, I would put Flight Sim Studios here as an average Flight Sim developers, having like an average quantity of developers who seem to have an average skill of Flight Sim developers. So it gives you an idea of what is possible to be created within a year's time frame. And if you remember going back to my first MD-11 video, then you will probably remember I said like, well, I personally kind of expect it to take a year until it comes up to the level that we are looking at for, you know, a version 1.0, which might still need a couple of updates, but it is a 1.0 and, you know, good and enjoyable to use then. And that is kind of what I expect for the Embraers in about a year's time from now as well, depending on how their FMS is going to look like at the first release and the amount of fixes that might be needed. Now, the overall idea here being that typically, if an early access product is released, do have a look at what it looks like, and then kind of think about, well, how much progress did other developers do over the time, and what is reasonable to be expected there. I did see, or at least personally I do believe I did see, amount of increase in self-confidence with developers, which in some cases is justified, in others is not. Like saying, okay, we're going to have the finished product out in 2 months' time, when clearly it is going to stay quite a bit longer. But the overall thing really is, okay, this is what the product looks like right now, and at least from a developer's or from a sales standpoint, we just gotta remind ourselves that early access is just a term to define like, okay, this thing is buggy. But in terms of a sales point, there is only one actual release of a product, and that is the first release of a thing to the public, because that is when the majority of customers is actually going to buy the product. I did talk to several developers who wanted to remain unnamed in the preparation of this video, and those were developers who did early access releases. And when asked about the sales numbers, most of them told me that the first early access release, within an amount of the first 2 weeks from the release, is going to make some 70% of the total sales of the product. So early access only is marketing term there in order to say like, okay, this is what our product looks like. It's not very good yet, we are working on updates though, but we kind of need the money now. And that's really what it seems to be about with a lot of those releases that we have seen. We don't have official confirmation of that from any developer willing to name their name, of course, which is totally understandable. But many of those Flight Sim developers these days seem to prefer getting unofficial loans from the community in order to finance their development in terms of early access releases, or in terms of just asking for money promising an early access, which seems to become a bit more popular as well, which I'm personally rather opposed to. But leaving that totally aside, the term early access more seems to be a term to be like, okay, we didn't really properly test it, we just brought something to the market that somewhat works, but isn't really all that complete. We will do quite a bit of work on it, but hey, we do need the money now, so here it is. Now, the big problem I have with that practice is that with many developers, we don't really know what to expect from the final product. Like, when the TFDI MD-11 was first announced, and when all the first adverts started coming in for it, I kind of expected it to get all the way up to the level of the 717 they did back in P3D, and to become a good, sophisticated, high-standard simulation. But these days, reading through the development updates that they post and talking about it being nearly feature complete, I kind of start to think that they are stepping backwards from what I perceive to be their earlier promises, and they kind of aim to make it more basic now. And that is the problem that I see with early access product. You do buy the product usually for something close to the full price, in some cases even for completely the full price, but you just don't know what to expect from the final product. You don't know how it's going to turn out, and in many cases those releases are actually from developers who don't really have a name to themselves where you could say like, okay, this is what I expect the final thing to be like. Let's assume for a second that Phoenix would release an early access of the A319 and A321. By now, we would have a very good example of what to expect from them from their recently released A320 series, where we did get a good idea of what they're capable of and what level they're going to be the final product to. Now, this would lead me to believe that, okay, I can trust these guys my money for the early access because I do believe them to be able to produce a very good product. And with that, I would happily buy an early access product from Phoenix. Now, with other developers who are releasing something for the first time, that's a bit more difficult, especially when you look into the names behind those brands though. In many cases, you will see established flight simulator names behind the new labels created for flight simulation. The Embraer is one example for that. If you look into who the people behind Flight Sim Studios are, you will figure out that they are by no way complete newcomers to the flight sim scene. All of them have previously worked in the flight simulator scene for quite a while. Now, shortly after their early access announcement and after the release, many people were like, well, but it's their first product, so we gotta give them the benefit of doubt. But when actually looking into who's involved there, you will see that those people have acted under different brands earlier in flight simulation, so they did have somewhat of an idea. But that would be a topic for its own separate video, which I'm not really going to go into today because this one is going on for almost 20 minutes already. So with all of that said, what's my final recommendation on early access then? Well, like I pointed out somewhere in the midst of the video, do have a look into the name of the developer at first, have a look into the people behind the company in question to see if they have any reasonable amount of experience. Like for example with the TFDI MD-11 early access, I'm confident they're going to deliver a good product because of their earlier achievements in flight simulation, namely the 717. With others, maybe or maybe not so much, but even complete newcomers like Azopoli creating the C160 Transal have delivered on a very good product and have really listened to the community, which is something that really deserves being named over here. So with that, I'm going to close this video with a recommendation. Have a look at what third-party reviewers, and I mean the independent ones, not the ones who get the product like pre-release from the developers in order to do adverts. Those are usually a little bit biased. I know that from my own videos, to be honest. So those are usually a little bit biased, and it may be a good idea just to have a look at those who did not receive the product ahead of time and have a look at their channels. And then make your decision like, okay, so we've seen how long it took for the Embraer to implement the systems and develop an EFB. We've seen how long it took PMDG to develop an EFB. We have also seen how long it takes to develop an FMS to a proper standard. Think about, from scratch, 2 years to get a decent device, 1 year of bug fixing until you've got it at a good state, and then think about if you're willing to invest into that product or rather not. Just don't let yourself be fooled by the type of airplane being featured. It might be something that people really want to see, let's say for example a Boeing 787. Just don't let yourself be fooled by the type of the product being picked there, but rather think about, okay, so What's the actual state of the product? Does it fit my demands, or does it rather not? Alright, I do hope that you liked what insights I could provide in this video, and I do hope that you found it interesting. Let me know if you like the contents of this one by posting below this video, so that I can tailor future videos in order to fit your likings a little bit better. And if you did indeed like the video, be sure to leave a like on YouTube as well, as it does really help out the channel. Finally, if you're up for more, don't forget to subscribe, and if you really like what I'm doing, would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.